Hello everyone, welcome to another installment of the Introductory Lecture Series. I am Professor Zaldivar, and today we'll be talking about Immanuel Kant's deontological ethical theory. Immanuel Kant tended to organize actions into two types, those justified via hypothetical imperative and those justified via a categorical imperative. Now an action is said to be justified by a hypothetical imperative if the reason for the action is that it is a means, in other words, if the action is a means to achieving some other more worthwhile end or object. So if you're doing something not because what you're doing is worth doing in itself, but because it gets you something else, for example, if you're working because it gets you money, then this is an action that is justified by a hypothetical imperative. Actions that are justified by hypothetical imperatives are not in and of themselves moral or immoral. Now, the other kind of action, an action that's justified by a categorical imperative, is said to be justified if the reason for the action is that the action is itself worthwhile without regard to any other outcome. In other words, if what you're doing is something you're doing for its own sake and not because the action gets you some other benefit, then it is justified or justifiable by a categorical imperative. And it is these sorts of actions that are the foundation of morality. In other words, if you're wondering whether you are doing something, whether what you are doing is moral or immoral, the answer boils down to: does the justification for your behavior pass the test of the categorical imperative? The categorical imperative is defined as this: act as though the maxim of your action were by your will to become a universal law of nature. In other words, act as though the reason for your action were to become a law that no one could avoid. If the result of this thought experiment is a world in which things are good, then your action is moral. If the result of the thought experiment is a contradiction or a world in which things are bad, then your action is immoral. So you can think of actions as being moral or immoral if they pass or fail the test of the categorical imperative. Another way to think about the categorical imperative is this: to act morally is to act in a way that everyone everywhere can live by. So your action is moral if the motivation is something that everyone everywhere can adopt. In order to help us understand this fundamental principle, Kant gives us 4 thought experiments. Now I warn you, on the following slide on your screen the numbering is off. Just go ahead and ignore that. Everything else is fine. The 4 thought experiments can be divided into are the thought experiment concerning a suicidal person, the thought experiment concerning a lying borrower, the thought experiment concerning someone, the leisurely person, and a thought experiment considering a selfish person. If you haven't read those, then you should pause the video now and go read those in the essay in your book. Okay, so assuming you've read those already, we can think about them one by one. In the thought experiment regarding a suicidal person, Kant concludes that the reason that the person is using to justify their suicide is the following: for love of myself, I will shorten my life in order to protect myself from future harm. Now, what would happen if everyone everywhere attempted to adopt this attitude or this justification? Well, Kant argues that what would happen is that we would find ourselves in a contradiction. It is a contradiction to use a principle which is meant to justify actions that improve life to end life. In other words, you cannot improve life by ending life. You cannot fix a car by destroying it. You cannot improve your life by committing suicide. Since the justification does not pass the test of the test of the categorical imperative, then the action, committing suicide, is not moral. In the second example, we have the example of a man who wants to lie to a bank in order to get a loan. and he knows he's lying because he knows he can't repay the loan. So the principle is something like this: it is acceptable to lie about repayment when borrowing money. Kant says that it is a contradiction to use a principle, the thing we just said, in a way that makes it impossible to use that principle. So if a principle sets up an impossible situation, then it is contradictory, and therefore the action fails to pass the moral test. So what would happen if everyone started lying in order to obtain loans? Well, pretty soon banks would realize that they have to stop giving loans because no one ever intended to repay them, and therefore it would become impossible to take a loan. So in other words, lying to obtain a loan leads to banks not giving loans, and that leads to being impossible to take a loan. So lying to borrow makes it impossible to borrow. This is a clear contradiction, and therefore the action, lying to borrow, fails the categorical imperative test. The third action, that of the leisurely person, and the fourth action, that of the selfish person, also fail to pass the categorical imperative. The third one fails to pass it because it is impossible for a person to fail to develop their natural talents. We are by nature inclined to develop our natural talents because our natural talents make our life better, and it is impossible for a person to sincerely wish for their life to be worse. And we have very much the same reasoning in the selfish person example. It is impossible for you to think that no one is responsible for you and you are responsible for no one, because sooner or later you're going to need someone's help. And in a situation in which you need someone's help, you cannot sincerely believe that no one, that it is immoral for anyone to help you. So, in all these examples, we find behavior that cannot be adopted by everyone everywhere. So all of these examples fail the categorical imperative test. There are a couple of thoughts that we have left to consider in the about Kantian ethical systems. One is that he thought ethics was a lot like mathematics and science, in that ethics is an objective, knowable science. And all we need to do in order to have moral agreements about whether an action is ethical or unethical is all of the relevant evidence and our own rational faculties. In other words, ethical reasoning is a deductive process by which we determine what our duty is. Now, this concept of duty is also important because Kant thinks that the only way to have a good will is to do only things that are in line with our moral obligations. In other words, to have a good will is to will what we recognize we are obligated to do. It is not to have a good intentions. It is not to be a nice person. It is to do only the things that are in line with our moral obligations. And it is acting in accordance with moral duty that makes us a good person. For Kant, being a good person or doing the right thing has nothing to do with consequences. It has nothing to do with your character or your internal nature or your instincts or intuitions. It is limited to knowing what your moral obligations are and then following through. That's what makes you a good person. Not your natural character, but whether you understand morality and follow through. Okay, so to understand Kant, you have to understand the categorical imperative, the test of the categorical imperative, and what it is that makes you a good person. Hopefully this introductory video has helped you understand those a little bit better. Kant is admittedly a very difficult person to read and a very difficult philosophy to understand, but it is really enlightening and it is really worthwhile getting to know, so I encourage you to put in the time to make sense of it. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.